Hey, everybody. Super excited for this guest and chat today with Dr. David Bray, a big picture thinker tackling global challenges. David, how are you?
I'm great, and it's great to be here with you, Evan. There's no shortage of challenges to be tackled.
Indeed. And I followed you on social media for, gosh, I guess a decade now. So really appreciate you and your body of work and maybe introductions to start to folks who may not be familiar with you and your work.
So the short version is I fell in my head at an early age. It made all the difference. The slightly longer version was lucky enough to be hired when I was 15 by the U.S. government, initially at a physics facility doing computer simulations of electron beams. But then when I was 17, got a classified role. It was basically at the time I couldn't say too much other than it was involving satellites and space and computer
Mm.
simulations, but was in support of, let's say, the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization and finding civilian applications using space back in the mid 90s. Worked briefly with Microsoft and Yahoo back in the late 90s. So I did private sector, but then parachuted into a role doing counter-bioterrorism, which was, again, in 2000, people really hadn't heard of. And literally was supposed to brief weeks in advance as to what we would do technology-wise should a bioterrorism event happen. That briefing just happened to be scheduled for September 11th, 2001, 9 o'clock in the
Wow.
morning. So we were kind of busy, dealt with a response to 9/11, ended up briefing the CIA on October 3rd, only to have the first case of anthrax show up 24 hours later in Florida. And then, of course, the threat letters. So responded to anthrax as well. Later, West Nile, severe acute respiratory syndrome, the original coronavirus, and other outbreaks. Got a PhD in a business school, and then briefly postdocs at MIT and Harvard, and then raised my hand to go to Afghanistan. Did some work there on the ground, both military and humanitarian missions. Came back, ghost wrote papers relating to policy, everything from cybersecurity to other activities, and became a senior national intelligence service executive. Played a role as the one nonpartisan director with 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats reviewing all the R&D efforts of the intelligence community. That was 2012, 2013. And then took on another fun role where there had been 9 CIOs in 8 years at the Federal Communications Commission. Always a great sign for CIO number 10 that things are just great. Could not say at the time that there had been 2 advanced persistent threats. In other words, foreign nation states doing stuff prior to my arrival that I couldn't even trust the IT systems I was inheriting. But we moved everything to public cloud and private hosting in about 2.5 years. And I give massive kudos to the team to do that. Along the way, we also got the Global CIO Award, both in 2015 and 2017, the team did. So massive kudos for that. And then went to go work with VentSurf with the People-Centered Internet Coalition.
Mm.
Behind the scenes was working with Special Operations Command on some issues, continued to advance things, was also a newborn. A newborn came to our lives for my wife and I that we had adopted. And then finally in 2020, I got another ask to do another commission. This time it was 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats, everything from the US to our friends and allies in cybersecurity, AI, bio, and space. And despite the fun, and I'll put fun in quotation marks, of getting anything bipartisan done in 2020, we did actually succeed in getting both support both from the Senate and the House. And the report was hand-delivered to both the Congress and the president at the time. And about 50% of our recommendations have been implemented. So now I work at the intersection of how tech and data is impacting companies geopolitically. I often say to companies, you may not care about geopolitics, but geopolitics cares about you. And technology is shaping how, unfortunately, things that used to be done with relative degree of freedom or protection, increasingly companies are the front line for either gray zone, what's called gray zone attacks, misinformation attacks, other things that sort of are just trying to hurt what the company's operations are to erode their performance.
Well, amazing. Well, why you don't have a Netflix show of your own, I'm not sure. I would watch that in a heartbeat. We'll save that for one day,
Another
maybe. Well,
day.
let's talk big picture AI and society. I mean, this is only a half an hour discussion, but are we moving too fast? Are we moving not fast enough? How do you think about this question and governance around it?
So I would actually say it's both. We're moving both too fast and not fast enough. On the not fast enough, we are doubling down on deep learning and large language models. And in one hand, that's good. I mean, it's quite impressive what they can do. Do not want to dismiss that at all. But deep learning algorithms date back to the late 80s, early 90s. And so it's only possible now because we have the computational cycles as well as all the data that we produced from the last 30 years of using the internet. There are better methods for certain fits to purpose. Again, large language models, if you want to generate things that look like human conversations, human voices, even video, perfect. But if you want to actually sort of identify trends in a changing world, if you want to infer what's coming next, if you want to predict the future, awful. And if anything, large language models are held back by they're only as good as the training data that they were trained on. And so I'm a big believer in active inference. I want to give a shout out to Carl Friston, if folks aren't familiar with his work. And I think there are some interesting startups now that are looking at active inference. I'd like to see that because we're going to need less data. We're going to need less computing cycles. It can actually be run on your laptop, and we won't need nuclear power plants to fund that. So that's the area where we're not moving fast enough. But at the same time, I think we're missing the human dimension. There's a lot of people that are fearful. I mean, we've had plenty of pundits that say it's going to replace their jobs. I'm not exactly sure it'll do it. It'll just change the nature of their work. They won't be doing as most rote and repetitive things, but they'll still do things. It'll just change. And so having empathy for the fact that AI is making people concerned, when you go into companies right now and you say, we're going to launch AI, I guarantee you 80% of your employees are like, should I sabotage that? I don't want to be out of a job. And so, having that deployment empathy for both companies and communities and what it means, I think is going to be vital. And so it's not about slowing that down per se, but maybe just having the human heart and understanding what you're doing when you go into situations and say, we're rolling out this new tech, understand what people are really thinking when you say that.
Yeah, great advice. And tied into that are cybersecurity challenges, something
Yes.
several lifetimes about, but it's on everyone's mind, your average person in the street as well. What's one or two things you think governments or organizations aren't getting right about cybersecurity at the moment?
Yeah. So again, from my own experience with the Federal Communications Commission, when I took on that role, as I mentioned, I couldn't come out and say we'd had 2 advanced persistent threats because you couldn't talk about it at the time. But, I look at it this way. Nobody would ask a commercial entity or a small organization, even a mid-sized organization, to buy surface-to-air missiles to defend themselves against, say, China and Russia. That's not what we would ask them to do. That there is a government agency that handles this called Department of Defense. At the same time, when we plug into the internet, we're essentially asking you to do that digitally. And so the question is, how do we help private companies? How do we help mid-sized organizations? How do we help startups that don't have the resources to defend themselves against nation-state level attacks? And there are increasing ones, one trying to steal your intellectual property, but then 2 also just try and create havoc. How do we help them? So that's something we're not getting right is the asymmetry of nation-state attackers. The second thing that we're missing, I often give, when I brief boards, I say, so 2019, global damages from ransomware were estimated at about $11 billion. 1 year later in 2020, global damages were about $20 billion. 1 more year later after that, 2021, it was now $43 billion. We're doubling every year in terms of ransomware damages. At the same time, the payoff that people are expecting from a ransomware attack is doubling, if not more. It went from, again, about $8,000 in 2019 to $230,000 or so on average 2 years later. That's not winning. Now, why is that happening? Why are the attackers asking for more money? We rolled out ransomware insurance, cybersecurity insurance, so they could ask for more. I'm like, oh, we did this to ourselves. But what does that also mean? Aside from the fact that there are now non-state actors with anywhere between 5 to 10 to maybe even north of that, 5 to 10 or more $1 billion that they have gotten from ill-gotten gains that they can put into R&D. And so we have seen, for example, I'm sure we've all seen the last 2 years, phishing emails have gotten really great. Why? They're using generative AI. But then you also probably have gotten the phishing attempts that actually reference a family member or a friend. How are they getting that information? Social media. They're combing social media and then targeting it. And then finally, there have been examples, sadly, of even for just small amounts like $10,000, you get that call where it's someone that's claiming it's a family member. There's been an accident. They need you to wire $10,000 right away. That's on the rise as well, where they're using audio deepfakes in a moment of crisis to try and extort money. And so I think the challenge is how does cybersecurity deal with the fact that generative AI is going to make it really, really hard to establish what's authentic versus inauthentic, and to make it really, again, social engineering. That's how people can actually do attacks without ever doing any actual cyber intrusion. The last thing I would say on that is, again, at my experience at the FCC, in 2017, we had a high-profile proceeding where we asked, behind the scenes, we asked General Counsel if we could use CAPTCHA for bots. And they said, no, it's a public commenting proceeding, so you can't use CAPTCHA because if they can't see and can't hear, they won't be able to file. That's a violation of the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946. 1946. All right, so I can't use CAPTCHA. Could I use invisible means to detect bots? No, because that looks like surveillance and government can't do surveillance. So I finally said, could I at least block obvious spam defined as 100 comments a minute? And they said no, because one of those 100 comments might be real. So in the end, as you know, history was, we were seeing 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 comments a minute. This was 2017, a minute at 4 a.m. U.S. Eastern time. Do I think they're all real? No. Do I need any more evidence? And I don't think they're all real. No. It's worth knowing that government agencies, less than 1% receive more than 10,000 comments for a public commenting period over 120 days total.
Wow.
And we're seeing that same amount in 2 minutes. Yeah, I don't need too much. But anyway, what I didn't know at the time when I came out is they said, well, is this a denial of service? I said, not at the network layer, but at the application layer, yes. And they said, well, where's your evidence? I said, patterns of life. And they're like, that's not forensics. I was like, I don't think I need forensics. It's clear that this is essentially flooding as a result of the fact that you told me I can't use CAPTCHA. Anyway, did my time, waited 4 years, and at the end of 4 years, the New York Attorney General concluded at least 18 million of the 23 million comments we finally got were politically manufactured, 9 million from one side of the aisle, 9 million from the other side of the aisle. But I raised that because that was 2017. So now as we look to 2025 onwards, yes.
Brutal. So, misinformation doesn't even necessarily require bots, and it's a wildfire these days. Are we getting any closer to getting it under control? I mean, is there a solution like blockchain that finally may come save the day, or what say you?
Yeah, so I think I would actually give a shout out to a group called Trust in Media. It's a 501c3. Ellen McCarthy, she was previously director of INR. That's the State Department's intelligence service. So Trust in Media is recognizing that in the United States and other free societies, you can't have people tell you what is truth or not, because that's hard and that's not a government function. What we can do is teach you to be skeptical, or at least when you read an article, if it's beginning to hijack your emotions, ask why. And begin to triangulate across different sources of information. But I'd like to point out to people, like this whole question of inauthentic or misinformation or things like that, it dates back to the founding of our country. Thomas Jefferson hired a political hitman to spread misinformation that John Adams wanted to go to war with France, when in fact he didn't. And he did that as the vice president of John Adams. Meanwhile, John Adams, as a sitting president, is writing about his vice president, Thomas Jefferson, claiming he's the devil. I mean, imagine if we had that on social media today, where the president and the vice president were like duking it out like that. That's how our country got created. And fast forward to 1890s, we had sensationalism, yellow journalism. That's how Pulitzer and Hearst sold their papers. And the United States may have gone to war with Spain over a disinformation event. Remember the Maine. So it's always been there. The difference is now with smartphones and everything that's out there, individuals can do what used to take, either very wealthy individuals or large organizations or countries to do.
Yeah, maybe we can go back to pamphlets and get off social media. That was a big thing here in
or
Boston
maybe the
back in
solution is, I remind people, as generative AI makes it harder to figure out what is real and what's not real online. Like, for example, search engine optimization manipulation. We know that's on the rise because with AI, generative AI, I can spawn 15,000 pages in 10 minutes that all are slightly different, that all point to the same search result. And guess what the search engine does? It elevates that to the top, whether it's authentic or not. And that might be why we're seeing search engine quality go down. But I raise that because maybe what we need to do is, just like in business, there's caveat emptor, buyer beware. Maybe we need to adopt caveat internet, which is anything you see on the internet, don't trust it until you've triangulated it from different sources.
Well said. So you worked on both the public and private sector side, obviously. Any lessons each side can learn from each other on some of these big problems, or are we just going to kind of keep crawling along here?
Well, first I say I love the fact that the U.S. has a private sector that's distinct from its public sector. I mean, that's our strength. Now, that creates interesting tensions because everyone's like, well, the public sector should be like the private sector. I'm like, yes, although point to me any private sector company that has 535 members of the board, each with their own agenda. That is part of the design of the U.S. public sector. Is you go back to Federalist Papers number 51, where they wanted ambition to counter ambition. Parts of the checks and balances that make the public sector work and why we don't become a autocracy is that each of the politically elected members are representing their interests of their own district or state. And that's good. That's goodness. So at the same time, I think the public sector needs to appreciate the hunger, the innovation, the cycle speed of the private sector. And we need to figure out ways to bring this in. When I talk to either private sector companies or public sector companies, I'm like, you need to create within your organization places where you can almost incubate new ideas. It's almost like a VC on the inside. And this is true even for large private sector companies that have been around for 5 or more years. They run the risk of losing that hunger that helps them innovate. And so you have to figure out a way of sort of reigniting that spark. So I think 2025 is going to be interesting because I think we're going to see a lot of possible broken glass, and at the same time, possibly a reigniting of those spaces where there is hunger to do things differently for public service for the benefit of the citizen. I mean, think about with generative AI. I'm already volunteering with efforts that are using chatbots to have conversations so that you don't have to fill out a form. Instead, you talk to the chatbot, and behind the scenes, it's filled out a Veterans Affairs claim or it's filled out a different claim for you. I mean, that is the future of public service in my mind, is we shift from using forms to conversations with people one-on-one.
Yeah, the low-hanging fruit for Gen AI, I think, is customer service, customer experience. It's changing everything right now as we speak. The other thing that's of interest to me, future of work, not just my work, but organizations, it's clear the impact of AI and automation is changing jobs. How is it affecting your day-to-day, if I can ask? And what do you think business leaders should do for their organizations to prepare for these changes?
Yeah. So I'll give one small example. So later today, I'm hosting a board discussion, and I gave the board members homework over the last 3 days to just answer 3 very simple questions. And literally, this is about 3 hours before the board meeting is going to happen, I pulled together all their answers, had generative AI summarize and actually show where they had similarities, where they had differences, produced a very short report from that. But then, of course, I also use an AI to produce a short podcast so they can either listen in advance of the meeting or read the report. And that was done 3 hours before the meeting, so that basically we have the most effective use of our 3-hour meeting in advance, because now we don't have to air everybody's opinions. We know everybody's opinions, and now we say, what are we going to do about it? So that's just one small example of how AI is changing the nature of work. For example, I'm working with NATO, where they actually have, in advance of the meeting, they have their chatbots ask internally, what are your expectations for the meetings? What should we be doing about this? And then when they actually have the meeting afterwards, they say, was that meeting effective? What could be done differently? And so I think the future is helping us free up cycles so that when we are doing in-person interactions, when we are doing things, it's the best use of our time. That's, to me, is what I think generative AI is going to be really great at. Now, again, there's other flavors of AI. There's computer vision. We could easily spend another 30 minutes talking about computer vision, how that's going to help, active inference, how that's going to help. You almost have to ask, what I would say is business leaders need to first recognize there are multiple flavors of AI. So when anyone talks about using AI in their organization, say, what flavor? And then 2, in what context? Because computer vision in radiology makes a lot of sense. Computer vision in customer support, not so much. So understanding the context as well. And then finally, I would say, prepare your organizations not just for the disruption of AI. We're going to have quantum coming down the turnpike. We already have commercial space. The fact that there are commercial space companies that can collect at 0.25 meter resolution anywhere in the world at 15 minutes notice. I mean, what companies are thinking about, what does that mean for how you provide better customer service when you can actually see things from above? But then also, what does that mean from competitive intelligence when your competitors might be doing the same thing? So think about space, think about quantum. I would submit that the next 10 years, there's going to be wave upon wave of seismic changes onto commercial organizations as well as governments. And the ones that thrive will be the ones that teach their employees to be always scanning for new business cases that move the organization forward using the technology.
Wow, great insights. You've been a big advocate of tech for good and sustainability, leveraging tech. Obviously a lot of people are seeing the impact of a changing climate, and even if the skeptics are reluctant to talk climate change, I think we all need to talk climate mitigation, whatever the cause.
Yes.
Do you think we're making progress there? And what needs to happen regardless of your belief about man-made
Yeah.
climate change.
Yeah. So I would say, yeah, exactly. The conversation needs to be about climate adaptation and what's happening. So I am seeing very interesting signs of light and signs of hope. And if anything, I actually try to remind people, don't give in to fear mongering. I mean, every decade is going to have its seismic issues that seem insurmountable, and we figure them out. Proof point that I have seen interesting startups that are using natural bacteria. This is natural bacteria, so nothing synthetic. They have used computer models to figure out how to produce the natural bacteria, but as they did, it's natural bacteria that uses methane as a sugar source. And we know methane is a greenhouse gas that's 22 to 40 times as bad as carbon dioxide. Use it as a sugar source, so it removes that from the environment, which is a good thing. And then it returns nitrogen to the soil, which is even better, because we know that we've lost between 80 and 90% of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in our soil as a result of agricultural practices. So you get a twofer. Now, the trouble is bacteria is hard to see. How do you make a business case for that? And so what I'm following now is, could you use drones? Could you use commercial space imaging to say, I'll fly over your field. I'll show where you have methane blooms, maybe from cattle or other things like that. And I'll also show where you're lacking nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Okay, now you give me half up front. I'll remediate it using the bacteria. And then 2 to 3 weeks later, I'll fly over again and show, look, results done. And so I actually think the way we get out of all the challenges with climate adaptation is going to be a lot of bacteria and other means that are using life itself and nature itself to help us thrive in the going forward. Think about the same bacteria used for actually sequestering carbon dioxide in a more solid form. So I think this is doable. The challenge is twofold. One, trying to link the conversation of climate adaptation to jobs, because if it's not linked to jobs, no politician's going to move forward on it. It's got to be about jobs. And then the second thing that's also not happening is, how do we model this before we do this? Because we only have one planet, and there could be some very good intentioned efforts that go run away and result in some bad things. So we need to actually put in place now ways to I almost want to say an FDA for testing things like this. So anyway.
I love that. And you mentioned drones, and this next question is a little out of left field. I apologize in advance, but we're all this UAV activity as of late. There seems to be a tsunami of sightings over places like New Jersey. Do you have an opinion on any of this? Is it just the drone economy getting out of control in a kind of ad hoc fashion, or should we plan for some UFO visits in the 2025?
So the first thing I would say is, Occam's razor. Usually the most likely explanation is the right one. And so back in, this was October of 2010, I got asked to give a briefing of over-the-horizon challenges. And I actually presented two to this. I can share this in unclassified context. One was I pointed to AI and said, AI is just going to get better and better. By 2020 or so, we're going to need to actually figure out how this is changing how societies, how companies operate. And at the time in 2010, everyone was like, yeah, right. But the other thing was, I pointed to what was happening with drones and the do-it-yourself drone movement. And I said, by 2020, we need to be ready for drones being used, not just in the battlefield by small nation states, not just the big actors, but small ones, Exhibit A, Ukraine. But then two, what happens when criminals start to use it? What happens when this is actually being used for reconnaissance before someone robs your house or things like that? And so I think a lot of what you're seeing with UAPs is the fact that we are aware that our airspace is being invaded by actors foreign, and we're trying to get a better handle on it. But the other thing that I think it points to is we still don't fully understand the phenomenology of the atmosphere. So it's probably a case where we need to both improve our instrumentation in privacy-preserving ways to be aware of when there are drones from either actors foreign or actors that are doing it for criminal reasons flying. And then two, we probably do need to have a better understanding of the atmosphere too.
Well said. And so no reason to panic. It's not World of Worlds, New Jersey.
As far as we know. And what I would say is, if you were an intelligent life form, you probably figure out other ways to announce your presence. Just saying.
Without lights, flashing red and green lights.
Yeah.
But thanks so much. Looking ahead, where can people find you, meet you, see you over the next couple of weeks, into the new year?
Sure. Best place is one, as you and I have connected often, on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn. And then the other place is the Simpson Center, where I am chair of the Accelerator. The Accelerator is intended to be a place where we incubate new ways of doing work at the same time as we figure out the policy simultaneously. No longer can we do policy that then leads to a program that eventually does something. We have to do this in parallel. So Stimson Center as well as LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, thanks for the insights and updates, and always a huge fan of your work, and onwards and upwards. Thanks, David.
Thank you, Evan. Onwards and upwards together.
Okay. Thanks, everyone, for